When the Mongols seemed unstoppable, one army dared to resist. At Ain Jalut in 1260, former slaves who had risen to rule Egypt faced Genghis Khan's heirs across a misty valley. The Mamluks, men who had known chains before command, carried with them the ashes of Baghdad and the last hope of Islam. Sultan Qutuz and General Baybars transformed disadvantage into victory through discipline and deception, luring the invaders into ambush with feigned retreat. In that green Palestinian valley, history pivoted. The Mongol tide receded for the first time, and from former captives arose an empire that would shape the Middle East for centuries. The earth trembled before sunrise. In the valley of Ain Jalut, mist rose from the grass like breath from a wounded beast. Horses stamped and snorted in the half-light, their flanks quivering beneath armor slick with dew. Somewhere beyond the haze, a trumpet gave a single hollow cry, the signal that would end an age. Across the plain, the Mamluk vanguard waited motionless, each rider a shadow upon the pale horizon. Banners hung limp in the stillness. Behind the ridgeline, hidden from sight, Sultan Qutuz sat upon a grey stallion, his hands resting on the reins, his eyes fixed on the east where the Mongol camp stirred to life. Dust rose like incense from their ranks, turning the dawn the colour of old bronze. The world had seen nothing like this meeting. The heirs of Genghis Khan facing slaves who had risen to rule an empire. A cry carried over the plain, the guttural chant of Mongol riders calling upon the eternal blue heaven. Qutuz whispered a prayer in answer. Behind him, the hills of Galilee caught the first light, and with it came memory. He thought of Baghdad, of cities burning, of libraries turned to ash. He thought of all that had been lost before this day, and of all that might yet be saved. Then he lifted his hand, and history turned back upon itself. Years earlier, the storm had begun far from these green hills, where the sky met the endless grass of Mongolia. From that horizon came Temujin, the orphan who would become Genghis Khan, uniting warring tribes beneath a single will. His armies moved like weather across Asia, unseen until they struck, unstoppable once they came. Cities that had taken centuries to build vanished in weeks. To the conquered, they seemed less men than fate itself, the embodiment of divine judgment delivered on horseback. When the great Khan died, his sons divided the world as one might divide the sky. Each ruled a quarter of creation, each carried the same hunger westward. The empire expanded not by accident, but by creed. Obedience, vengeance, and the right of the strong to rule. From the Oxus to the Caspian, from China to the Black Sea, the hoofbeats of the Mongols echoed like drums of doom. Into Persia rode Hulagu Khan, grandson of the conqueror, his banners marked by the falcon of the steppe. He was not a mere warlord, but the instrument of an idea, that no civilization should stand outside Mongol dominion. His campaign began with the mountains of Dalam, where the assassins kept their eagle nests above the clouds. Alamut fell in fire. Its gardens turned to smoke, its libraries to dust. The sect that had defied kings for centuries vanished in a week. From there, Hulagu descended into Mesopotamia, carrying with him engineers from China, scouts from Turkestan, and the cold conviction that mercy was weakness. Beyond the Euphrates lay the prize that had tempted conquerors for generations. Baghdad, the jewel of Islam, seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. Once it had been the heart of the world, a city where traders from every shore met beneath domes that glittered like constellations. Scholars measured the stars there, poets compared them to the eyes of their beloved, and merchants carried silk and scripture along the same streets. Yet by the 13th century, its splendor had grown hollow. The Caliph's armies were ghosts. His ministers schemed for privilege rather than power, and the faithful trusted in the illusion that holiness could defend what soldiers no longer could. When Hulagu's envoys arrived demanding submission, Caliph al-Mustasim dismissed them with arrogance born of centuries of unbroken pride. He believed Baghdad untouchable, its sanctity guarded by heaven itself. His astrologers assured him that the stars favored peace. His generals assured him that the walls were strong. Both were wrong. In January 1258, the horizon darkened. Mongol standards appeared like thunderclouds rolling over the plains of Iraq. Siege engines the size of towers moved with mechanical grace. Catapults hurled stones that shattered minarets as easily as pottery. The city resisted for 10 days. On the 11th, its gates burst open beneath fire. The defenders fought street by street until the Tigris ran crimson. The conquerors moved methodically, district by district, mosque by mosque, until nothing living remained. The Caliph was captured and brought before Hulagu, who regarded him not as a ruler, but as an artifact. He ordered the sovereign of Islam wrapped in carpets and trampled beneath horses, so that royal blood would not defile the earth. With that, the house of Al-Abbas came to its end, crushed not by heresy or rebellion, but by the indifference of time. For 40 days, the sack continued. The libraries of Baghdad, repositories of a millennium's learning, fed the flames. The river turned black with ink and red with blood. Chroniclers wrote that fish died by the thousands, smothered in the knowledge of men. Astronomers, philosophers, calligraphers, all perished or were taken east to serve their conquerors. What had been the mind of the Islamic world became its wound. News of the catastrophe spread faster than the armies themselves. Refugees poured westward, carrying tales that no listener could believe, yet none could dismiss. In Aleppo and Damascus, the markets fell silent as preachers warned of the wrath descending from the east. The faithful prayed for a deliverer. The wise packed their books and fled. Only Egypt remained untouched, its rulers watching from afar as empire after empire crumbled. There, on the banks of the Nile, power had passed into unexpected hands. The Mamluks, soldiers once purchased as slaves, had seized the throne through blood and cunning. Their sultan, Al-Mu'iz Aybak, ruled in the name of the widow who had chosen him, Shajar al-Dur, the pearl of the palace, whose brief reign had proved that strength could wear a woman's veil as easily as a man's sword. Under their successors, the barracks of Cairo became the forge of a new dynasty, one hardened by discipline and united by fear of what waited beyond the desert. Among their ranks rose a man who had once been property and was now becoming legend, Qutuz. Born in the north, captured by Mongol raiders, sold and resold until Egypt claimed him, he carried within him both the memory of bondage and the instincts of those who had broken the world. While others spoke of vengeance, he trained for it. The destruction of Baghdad had not merely ended an empire, it had lit a fire in the heart of a captive who would someday face its authors across a battlefield at dawn. The mist of Ain Jalut begins to lift. Far ahead, the Mongol vanguard lowers its lances. Baybars' line stirs on the plain, feigning retreat just as the plan demands. Qutuz draws his sword and looks once toward the rising sun. The wind carries the smell of trampled grass and the memory of fallen empires. What began in the ashes of Baghdad will find its reckoning here. As the fires of Baghdad finally dimmed, their glow still stained the sky of Asia. Smoke drifted for weeks along the Tigris, darkening the sunrise from Mosul to Basra, a banner of mourning visible for 1,000 miles. Travelers who passed through the ruins spoke of streets where bones crunched beneath their horses' hooves, of domes collapsed into pools of molten tile, of silence so complete that even the river seemed to whisper its lament in hushed tones. The city that had once measured the world's knowledge now served as its warning. Hulagu established his camp upon the western bank, raising pavilions embroidered with the symbols of conquest. His scribes catalogued what remained: craftsmen to rebuild bridges, scholars useful for astrology, hostages valuable for ransom. The rest were discarded. From the ashes of the Caliphate, he fashioned a new dominion, the Ilkhanate, a western outpost of the Mongol Empire governed not by faith, but by decree. Persian secretaries filled his chancery. Chinese engineers supervised his siege workshops. Syrian interpreters recorded the tribute exacted from trembling envoys. The empire of Genghis had become not merely a horde, but a machine. Yet Hulagu's ambition extended beyond mere administration. To the northwest lay Syria, gateway to the Mediterranean and the Crusader ports that glittered along its coast. To conquer it would mean mastery of every road between the Oxus and the sea. He sent word to the princes of Christendom, inviting alliance against the Muslims who, he claimed, had defied both heaven and reason. From the kingdom of Armenia came messages of friendship. From Antioch, oaths of cooperation. Even King Louis of France, nursing the failure of his own crusade, dispatched envoys to explore the possibility of a partnership that might restore Christian fortunes through Mongol arms. For a moment, the unthinkable seemed possible. East and West united beneath banners of vengeance. But Hulagu's plans would always serve his empire first. Where Christians imagined holy war, he envisioned only conquest. His soldiers carried crosses upon their standards beside the falcon of the steppe, yet they bowed to no creed save victory. In 1259, the storm rolled into northern Syria. Aleppo fell after a siege so brief that survivors swore the city surrendered to fear before it surrendered to fire. The ancient citadel was breached by towers dragged across the plains by teams of oxen. Within days, its walls were blackened ruins. Chroniclers wrote that the screams of its inhabitants echoed across the Orontes, mingling with the chants of Mongol priests and the hymns of Armenian allies giving thanks for triumph. Those who had believed the Tigris would halt the invaders now saw that nothing in creation could. Damascus, hearing of Aleppo's fall, opened its gates without resistance. The Mongols entered as masters, respectful yet absolute. They appointed governors, minted coins, and demanded tribute measured in gold, horses, and hostages. For a season, order returned, an order sustained by fear and the memory of Baghdad's ashes. Merchants reopened their shops, envoys from the coast brought gifts, and some wondered if Mongol dominion might prove more stable than the squabbling emirs who had preceded it. The illusion lasted until the riders came south. In the spring of 1260, Hulagu turned his attention toward Egypt, the last independent power of the Muslim world. Letters were sent to Cairo demanding submission. Their tone was measured, almost courteous, yet each phrase carried the weight of threat. "We have destroyed the Caliph. Who are you to stand against us?" Within the citadel of Cairo, the letter was read aloud before Sultan Qutuz and his assembled emirs. The hall fell silent. When the reading ended, he rose, ordered the envoys seized, and commanded their heads struck from their shoulders. Their bodies he hung from the city's gate as warning to any who doubted his resolve. The declaration of war was complete. The decision shocked his court. Many urged negotiation, pointing out that no army had ever withstood the Mongols in open battle. Qutuz listened without comment, then answered in words that would echo through the centuries. He who fears death is already dead. The hall erupted in acclaim, and within days, Egypt began to arm for the confrontation that destiny had delayed but could not prevent. Across the deserts of Sinai, scouts rode day and night, carrying orders to garrisons and summoning distant contingents. Blacksmiths hammered through the night, mosques filled with volunteers pledging to die in defense of faith. The Sultan's general, Baybars al-Bundukdari, oversaw the preparations with a precision born of both ambition and brilliance. Born a slave like his ruler, Baybars possessed the restless energy of a man who believed himself chosen by fate. Together, master and lieutenant forged an army that mirrored the discipline of their Mongol enemies, but drew its spirit from conviction rather than fear. Meanwhile, Hulagu's own designs began to unravel. News reached him from the east that the great Khan Munka had died, leaving the succession uncertain. As claimant to the throne, Hulagu was compelled to withdraw the greater part of his host toward Persia to secure his inheritance. In his absence, he left command of Syria to Kitbuka Noyan, a seasoned warrior of Nestorian Christian faith, whose zeal for conquest carried the fervor of religion as well as empire. The detachment he commanded was formidable but not limitless. 20,000 riders hardened by years of campaign, certain that heaven still rode at their side. Kitbuka advanced into Palestine, burning every village that resisted and demanding tribute from those that submitted. His forces reached as far as Gaza, planting the Mongol standard within sight of the sea. Refugees streamed ahead of him toward Egypt, scholars, merchants, soldiers, and peasants alike, each bringing tales that grew more dreadful with each retelling. Cairo became a city of exiles, its streets choked with fear and fury. In the barracks of the citadel, Qutuz reviewed his cavalry beneath the hot glare of summer. The air shimmered above the desert sands, banners snapped like whips in the wind. Every man there had once been a slave. Every face bore the mark of discipline etched by the Mamluk code. Loyalty to the brotherhood, faith in the sword, contempt for despair. They had been torn from the steppes as children, trained in obedience, sold as property, and in that crucible they had become the most efficient fighting force of the age. Now they would test themselves against the very people from whom many of them had been taken. The march north began beneath a sun so bright that the horizon seemed aflame. Through the barren wastes of Sinai, they moved in silence, their columns stretching for miles, each rider carrying his water and his prayers. At night, they bivouacked among the dunes, listening to the wind moan like ghosts across the sand. Scouts rode ahead into the darkness, returning with reports of Mongol patrols near Gaza. Every step brought them closer to the frontier, where faith and fear would meet. By late August, the Mamluk army reached the fertile valleys of Galilee. There, near the spring, known as Ain Jalut, they halted. Baybars studied the terrain, the rolling hills, the narrow valley, the streams that could mask an ambush, and declared it ideal. Here, he told Qutuz, the horsemen of the steppe will find their sky too small. Orders went out to conceal the main body behind the ridges, while the vanguard prepared to draw the enemy in. The trap was set with the patience of hunters who knew their quarry by heart. Beyond those hills, Kitbuka's scouts observed the movement of dust and thought the Egyptians few in number. Confident of easy victory, he ordered the advance. Neither he nor his men suspected that the fate of empires waited within that quiet valley. The dawn that followed would erase the memory of 100 defeats. It would prove that the invincible could bleed, that the tide which had drowned the world could, at last, be turned. But for now, on the eve of battle, the valley lay silent. its grass still wet with dew, its air trembling with the breath of two civilizations about to collide. Before the banners of Egypt ever reached Ain Jalut, they had been carried through darker fields, the battlefields of identity, obedience, and survival. The men who would save the Islamic world were not princes born to thrones, but soldiers born to chains. Their story began not with crowns, but with markets. Across the grasslands of Kipchak and Circassia, raiders rode like harvesters through the villages of the north. Children were torn from their families, driven in herds toward the Black Sea, sold by weight and age. Their names were forgotten before the journey ended. They were cargo, human currency traded for gold, grain, and weapons. From the ports of Crimea, they were carried southward in ships that smelled of sweat and salt, bound for the markets of Alexandria and Cairo, where the buyers waited. There, in the shade of latticed courtyards, these pale-skinned captives were examined like horses. Traders spoke in Turkish, Arabic, and Greek. Scribes recorded each purchase in careful script. To the world, they were Mamluk, owned. To the men who bought them, they were potential weapons, raw material for the making of soldiers who would owe everything to their masters and nothing to the world they left behind. Within the stone walls of Cairo's barracks began a transformation that would shape empires. The new recruits were stripped of language, custom, and kin. They were given Arabic names and taught to bow to God alone and to their commander as the shadow of his authority. Every morning, they rose before dawn to drill with sword and bow, learning to ride, to strike, to obey without question. Their training blurred the line between worship and warfare. The same voice that recited the call to prayer could shout orders in battle an hour later. Through this regimen, the Mamluks became a brotherhood, bound by loyalty stronger than blood. They called one another ʿAin, brothers, not by birth, but by oath. They shared meals, wounds, and the certainty that only the sword would define their worth. Among them, rivalry was fierce but honorable. Cowardice was unknown, for punishment was swift and final. In their eyes, freedom was not the absence of chains, but mastery of self. Egypt, ruled by the Ayyubid dynasty since the days of Saladin, had long relied on these foreign-born warriors. Each generation of rulers had purchased its legions from the same markets, trusting strangers more than natives. Yet over time, the buyers became the bought. Mamluk generals rose through the ranks, commanding armies, guarding palaces, and eventually shaping the politics of the realm they were meant to serve. They married into noble families, built estates along the Nile, and replaced their masters through a patience that only discipline could sustain. When the last Ayyubid sultans quarreled among themselves, the Mamluks moved with the precision of men accustomed to seizing opportunity in battle. In 1250, amid the confusion that followed the death of Sultan, Al-Salih Ayyub, his widow Shajar al-Dur, assumed control of Egypt, concealing her husband's death until she could secure power. The widow of a conqueror, she possessed both intellect and audacity. Her rule, brief but brilliant, defied every tradition of the age. Chroniclers wrote that she governed from behind a screen, her voice calm, her decrees merciless. For months she held the realm together, facing not only internal rebellion, but the advance of a new crusade from France. That invasion, led by King Louis IX, ended in disaster at Al-Mansura. Mamluk commanders, including the rising officer Baybars al-Bundukdari, turned the tide of battle through tactics learned in endless training yards. They trapped the crusading army within the canals of the Nile Delta, slaughtered its knights, and captured its king. The victory transformed Egypt from a besieged province into the champion of Islam. Yet triumph bred unrest. Shajar al-Dur, surrounded by ambitious captains, found herself forced to choose a husband to placate the emirs. She selected al-Muizz Aybak, one of her former lieutenants, elevating him to sultan while she ruled beside him in name and above him in practice. Their alliance, like most forged in politics, ended in betrayal. Aybak sought to claim full power. The queen struck first, ordering his death within the palace baths. Her enemies responded with fury. Shajar al-Dur was seized, beaten, and flung from the citadel's walls. The woman who had ruled Egypt longer than many kings died nameless upon the stones. Her body left for 3 days before burial. Her fall marked the end of the Ayyubid legacy and the beginning of the Mamluk age. From the chaos that followed rose Qutuz, a man shaped by both cruelty and clarity. Once a captive sold in the same markets as his soldiers, he had ascended through rank and battle, admired for his composure and feared for his decisiveness. In a world collapsing under Mongol pressure, he represented the paradox of his people, a slave who commanded sultans. When he seized the throne in 1259, it was not through ambition alone, but necessity. Egypt needed a sword, not a symbol, and Qutuz was both. His first months as ruler were spent extinguishing rebellion. Rival emirs whispered of replacing him. Syrian refugees doubted his strength. Merchants feared the collapse of trade as caravans ceased to cross a devastated east. Yet the Sultan governed with the patience of a man who had survived worse. He repaired the canals, secured the treasury, and imposed discipline upon the restless army. His word became law and his presence assurance. By the time Hulagu's envoys arrived from Damascus with demands for submission, Cairo was ready for the choice that would define its fate. When those envoys were executed, Egypt awoke to a new identity. No longer a refuge, it had become the last bastion. Sermons in the great mosques thundered with verses of defiance. Craftsmen engraved Quranic inscriptions upon sword blades. Children sang of victory not yet won. The spirit that had slept through centuries of decadence stirred again, clothed now in armor and obedience. Baybars, restless and brilliant, emerged as Qutuz's indispensable partner. His hawk-like eyes missed nothing. His voice carried the weight of command that soldiers recognized before they obeyed. Together, they reorganized the army, blending discipline with devotion. Each regiment was balanced between Turkish, Circassian, and Kurdish contingents, united not by blood, but by cause. The Mamluks understood that the Mongols could be defeated only by a force that mirrored their own, a cavalry as swift, an intelligence as cold, a faith more enduring than their rage. Qutuz knew that victory would demand more than courage. It required unity. In councils he spoke of destiny, but privately he measured logistics, fodder, water, weapons, morale. Scouts were sent northward to gauge the terrain of Palestine. Spies dispatched into Mongol-held Syria to learn the movements of Kitbuka's army. Every decision was weighed as if by an accountant of lives. In these months, Cairo transformed. The clang of hammer and anvil echoed from dawn to dusk. The scent of leather and sweat filled the streets near the armories. Mosques overflowed with men praying for strength. Markets thrived on anticipation, not fear. The city that had once purchased warriors was now producing them in spirit. Egypt stood alone, yet its isolation gave it focus, a purity of purpose unknown to larger empires. When Qutuz finally rode from the citadel to lead his army north, the people lined the streets, casting rose petals and tears upon his path. Chroniclers recorded that the air itself seemed charged with the presence of destiny. Behind him marched the future, thousands of men who had known slavery and now carried the freedom of nations upon their spears. The desert awaited, vast and indifferent, but the Mamluks rode with the calm of men who had already faced the worst the world could do and survived it. Far ahead lay the green valleys of Galilee, and within them the enemy who believed no mortal power could stand against him. The stage of history was set once more upon open ground, where the fate of faith and empire would depend not on birth, but on those forged in bondage and tested by fire. The sun over Sinai was merciless. It stripped color from the landscape until sand and sky became one vast glare. Across that emptiness moved the army of Egypt, a procession of dust and endurance. For weeks they had advanced northward, tracing routes once followed by prophets and caravans, now reclaimed by war. Each step carried them farther from the safety of the Nile, and closer to the memory of every empire that had perished before the Mongols. Scouts rode ahead like shadows, their eyes scanning the horizon for movement. Behind them, columns of cavalry stretched mile upon mile, bows slung beside saddles, lances upright as a forest of steel. Water, skins swung from belts, heavy with the last of their rationed supply. When night fell, men wrapped their cloaks against the chill and listened to the wind sighing across the dunes, as if the desert itself whispered the names of those who had died beneath its stars. Qutuz rode at the center, surrounded by the emirs who commanded his divisions. His armor, polished to dull silver, reflected the heat without gleam. He carried no jewels, no banners of personal glory, only the simplicity of command. Every decision passed through him: where to halt, when to march, how to ration food, when to pray. He spoke little, but his silence held authority. Those who had once doubted him now followed with a devotion that bordered on faith. Beside him rode Baybars, tireless as ever, his hawk-like gaze shifting from ridge to ridge. He directed scouts, checked supplies, corrected formations before mistakes could bloom into danger. The two men could not have been more different. Qutuz, deliberate, inward, cautious. Baybars, impulsive, fierce, radiant with energy. Yet between them there existed a bond forged in necessity, mutual respect sharpened by ambition. Each man aware that history would remember only one of them as the savior of Islam. The desert crossing tested more than endurance. It tested belief. Men fainted from thirst and were buried where they fell, a spear planted in the sand to mark the spot. Camels collapsed beneath their loads, their bones bleaching before sunset, yet no one turned back. In each hardship, the soldiers saw proof of divine favor. If God willed their destruction, they reasoned, it would have come already. The imams who marched with the army reminded them that victory was not promised to those who survived, but to those who endured. When they reached Gaza, the first city of Palestine, they found its gates abandoned. Smoke rose from the harbor, where Mongol detachments had passed weeks earlier, leaving ash where markets had once thrived. The army entered in silence. Broken tiles crunched beneath the hooves of their horses. Burnt palm trunks cast long shadows across the sand. In the ruined mosque, Qutuz knelt amid the soot and prayed. His words were simple: Lord of the worlds, let this place not fall again. From Gaza, they marched northeast through the orchards of the coast, where the scent of orange blossoms mingled with the stench of war. Villages emptied at their approach, some in fear, others in reverence. Peasants brought water from wells, bowing low before the men who represented the last hope of the faithful. In every town, the same question met them: can they truly be defeated? Qutuz answered only by continuing north. Beyond the plains of Ramla, they entered the hills of Galilee. The air cooled, the ground grew green, and streams cut silver paths through the grass. Here, Baybars halted his column and studied the terrain with a strategist's eye. The valley of Ain Jalut, narrow and sheltered by rising ground, offered what the desert never could: cover. Here, he said, the steppe will betray them. His plan took shape quickly. The vanguard would engage, feign retreat, draw the Mongols into the open basin. The main force, concealed behind the ridges, would strike when the enemy overextended. It was audacity disguised as prudence, a battle built upon illusion. For days they waited. Messengers reported that Kitbuka-Noyan, the Mongol general, had advanced south with perhaps 20,000 riders. They were veterans of a dozen conquests, men who had crossed half the world without knowing defeat. Each carried the confidence of destiny, the arrogance of those who believed heaven itself rode above their banners. They camped near the Jordan, unaware that the same heaven now watched another people preparing for its judgment. In the Mamluk camp, tension thickened with the evening air. Soldiers sharpened their blades and whispered prayers. Armorers moved among the lines, testing the girths of saddles, the string of bows. Fires were kept low, voices lower. On the eve of what all believed would decide the world's fate, the army grew strangely calm. Some wrote letters home that would never be sent. Others recited verses from memory, binding their courage to rhythm. Qutuz spent the night alone in his tent, reading the Quran by lamplight. The verses of steadfastness spoke to him not as scripture, but as command. In their reflection, he saw the arc of his own life: child of the north, captive of the Mongols, soldier of Egypt, ruler by necessity. He realized that every step had led to this valley, that the chain of empires broken and remade since Genghis Khan's birth had narrowed to a single point in time: tomorrow. He closed the book and extinguished the light. Before dawn, the call to prayer rose across the camp. Thousands of voices answered as one, rolling over the hills like thunder beneath the stars. When the final Allahu Akbar faded, the army mounted. Banners unfurled, green for faith, black for vengeance, white for victory. The rising sun caught their edges, turning silk to flame. Baybars took command of the vanguard, his face half hidden beneath his helmet. Qutuz positioned himself with the reserves behind the ridges, where the valley narrowed. Scouts reported dust on the horizon, Mongol riders approaching at full speed. Kitbuka had seen their movement and mistaken it for flight. The trap was working. Qutuz rode to the crest of a hill and watched the enemy form ranks. Lines upon lines of horsemen gleaming in lacquered armor, their standards marked with the symbols of the falcon and the cross. Drums beat, low and steady. The ground shook as they advanced. He closed his eyes and murmured a final prayer. Let the slaves of yesterday guard the world tomorrow. A horn sounded, Baybar's signal. The Mamluk vanguard wheeled, released a volley of arrows, and began to fall back in disciplined retreat. The Mongols, believing victory certain, pursued with shouts that split the morning. Their cavalry thundered into the valley, deeper and deeper until the hills swallowed them. Behind those hills, Qutuz raised his sword. The light caught its blade like lightning. "O Islam!" he cried, his voice echoing across the plain. Around him, the hidden ranks surged forward, spears leveled, hooves pounding. The ambush exploded from the ridges like the breaking of a dam. In that instant, history turned. When the last embers of Baghdad cooled beneath the winter rain, the conquerors looked west and saw new horizons waiting. The storm had not yet spent its force. It merely changed direction. From his encampment on the plains of Mesopotamia, Hulagu surveyed the maps laid before him, names older than empires, cities sung about in poems, kingdoms divided by pride. To his generals he spoke not of plunder, but of permanence. Persia was secure. Now Syria would be made to kneel. The order of march went out before spring. Columns of riders moved with the precision of clockwork, siege trains following in their wake. From the mountains of Armenia came Christian auxiliaries. From the plains of Iran, engineers versed in the machinery of destruction. They carried banners painted with the falcon of the steppe, fluttering beside crosses and crescents taken from conquered lands. It was an army less like a nation than a moving continent, tongues, customs, and gods, united only by obedience to a single will. Still, even the power of such an empire could not escape the uncertainty of succession. News reached the Western Front that Mongol, the great Khan, had died far away in the east. The line of Genghis trembled as his heirs began to gather for the choosing of a new sovereign. Hulagu, grandson of the founder and claimant to that legacy, faced a choice between ambition and conquest. He could not risk absence from the council that would determine who ruled half the world. Reluctantly, he broke camp, leaving command in the hands of his most trusted lieutenant, Kitbuka Noyan, a general famed for courage and conviction. Kitbuka's faith set him apart. A Nestorian Christian, amid followers of many creeds, he carried a sense of divine mission as fierce as any prophet's. To him, victory was not mere conquest, but judgment. When he took command of the Western host, he swore before his priests that he would cleanse the land of hypocrisy and idolatry alike. His oath carried weight. Those who marched with him spoke of seeing the cross and the falcon side by side above his tent. The advance into northern Syria began like a ritual. Aleppo stood first in the path, a city proud of its lineage, ruled by princes who traced descent from the companions of Saladin. Behind its walls, citizens whispered that the Mongol tide might finally break upon their stone ramparts. It did not. The city fell after only a week of siege. The citadel that had withstood centuries of war surrendered to the thunder of engines that hurled boulders larger than oxen. Fires leapt from quarter to quarter. The minaret of the great mosque cracked and fell like a tree. Those who survived the sword were driven into exile, their voices scattered on the wind. Southward, the tide rolled on. The defenders of Hama fled before it. Homs capitulated without a fight. Each conquest fed the next. Fear traveled faster than hoofbeats. Refugees clogged the roads leading to Damascus, telling stories of rivers turned red and skies black with smoke. Chroniclers wrote that whole villages were deserted at the rumor of approaching banners. The terror of the Mongols had become a weapon more effective than steel. When Kitbuka reached Damascus, he found its gates open. The city that had once been the pearl of the Umayyads offered no resistance. Its ruler, seeing the futility of defiance, rode out to submit. The conqueror entered in formal procession, cavalry at the fore, banners at his side, priests chanting hymns of triumph in a tongue unknown to the trembling crowds. The markets remained open under his watch. The mosques were guarded, not looted. For a brief moment, order returned, the cold, impersonal order of occupation. But even under this uneasy calm, the signs of ruin multiplied. Caravan routes lay empty, their guards slain or scattered. Merchants who once traveled between Cairo and Baghdad now dared not cross the Jordan. The scholars who had fled from the burning cities of the East found refuge only in the deserts of Palestine. Every border seemed haunted by rumor. To the faithful, it appeared as though the world itself were unraveling, and the heavens no longer listened. In Egypt, word of these disasters struck like thunder. The news arrived with refugees whose faces were gaunt from hunger and terror. They carried nothing but stories of children sold into slavery, of cities leveled, of Kitbuka's cruelty disguised as faith. In the citadel of Cairo, Qutuz heard them all in silence. Around him the emirs argued, some demanding fortifications, others urging negotiation. He dismissed both. "Walls will not save us," he said. "Only men will." Thus began the transformation of Egypt from spectator to savior. Qutuz and Baybars labored side by side to rebuild the army into an instrument of precision. Messengers rode to the borders of Nubia and the Levant, summoning every regiment still loyal to the Sultanate. Armorers worked through the night forging mail and arrowheads. Scribes recorded supplies with mathematical care. The forges of Cairo rang like drums. Each clang of the hammer was an oath. To the people, Qutuz presented himself not as monarch, but as guardian. He rode through the markets unguarded, speaking to merchants and scholars, reminding them that the Nile had endured every empire since time began and would endure this one as well. His calm steadied the capital. In the mosques, preachers spoke of jihad, not as vengeance, but as justice, a struggle to restore balance to a world bent by tyranny. Meanwhile, in the occupied north, Kitbuka ruled from Damascus like a man drunk on triumph. He sent envoys to the Christian princes of the coast, proposing a joint assault on Egypt. Some hesitated, wary of a conqueror whose friendship had buried allies before. Others sent polite replies, but raised no troops. The dream of a crusade, reborn under Mongol banners, faded into uncertainty. The general mistook silence for consent and pressed on. By midsummer, the invaders had reached the borders of Palestine. They believed the campaign nearly done, that Egypt would surrender as the rest had done. But in Cairo, the forges still sang, the prayers still rose, and the armies were gathering. Qutuz understood that the war would not be decided by walls or numbers, but by will. To confront the sons of the steppe, he must become their mirror. Mobile, disciplined, merciless when mercy meant extinction. He chose the timing with care. The Nile's flood had begun to rise, sealing the south against movement and ensuring that every soldier would fight, knowing there was no retreat. When the banners of Egypt finally unfurled above the citadel, the city erupted in chants that echoed through its streets. God is our sufficiency, and He is the best of defenders. The march north began under a sun that burned like prophecy. Across the sands of Sinai, the columns advanced once more, their rhythm steady as the pulse of a single heart. At night, campfires dotted the dunes like stars fallen to earth. From afar they looked fragile, but within those circles of light, men spoke of destiny as if it were a companion sitting beside them. They reached Gaza to find its ruins still smoking from Kitbuka's passage. In the mosque, where the pulpit had been shattered, Qutuz ordered a new one built overnight. "Let prayer rise where pride has fallen," he said. At dawn, the muezzin's voice returned to the city, a sound that carried farther than any trumpet. The army moved on. Beyond them lay the fertile valleys of Galilee, where water ran clear and the grass concealed 1,000 memories of past wars. There, Qutuz halted and looked north. He knew that the enemy was near, that somewhere beyond those hills, the same riders who had broken Baghdad waited, certain of another easy victory. He said nothing, but the soldiers around him felt the change in the air. The long retreat of the Islamic world had ended. From now on, every step would be an advance. For a brief season after the conquest of Damascus, Kitbuka ruled in stillness. The city's markets reopened under Mongol supervision. Taxes were levied with methodical precision, and patrols rode each night through streets once bright with lanterns. To the terrified survivors of war, this order seemed almost merciful. The conqueror held council in the Umayyad Mosque, seated upon a throne taken from the governor's palace, proclaiming peace to those who obeyed and ruin to all who resisted. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes drifted south. Conquest, like fire, cannot rest while anything remains unburned. From this fragile calm grew ambition. Messengers arrived from the Crusader states along the coast, envoys bearing cautious gifts, their faces schooled to courtesy. They came from Acre, from Tripoli, from the fortresses that clung to the Levantine hills like shells upon rock. Each sought reassurance that their ports would be spared. Kitbuka, confident of destiny, welcomed them with open hands and veiled intentions. To some, he promised alliance. To others, safe passage. To all the same message: Egypt will be next. The promise spread faster than the messengers could return. By the time they reached their lords, every rumor had become prophecy. Beyond the city's walls, Syria bled. Villages along the Orontes stood deserted, their wells choked with ashes. Caravans that once carried spice and silk lay overturned beside the road, their merchants vanished. Yet from these ruins came whispers that something new stirred to the south. A host gathering beneath green banners. A ruler who had slain Mongol envoys without fear of reprisal. Such defiance seemed impossible, but fear gave the story weight. Kitbuka laughed when he heard it. "Let the slave come," he said. "I will send him back to Cairo in chains." Each boast carried northward to Qutuz through traders, monks, and spies. In the citadel of Cairo, the Sultan listened without visible anger. He understood that arrogance was a weapon one might turn against its owner. While Kitbuka ruled by terror, he would rule by endurance. Orders went out quietly to strengthen the garrisons along the frontier, to prepare grain depots and water reserves in the desert. Where the Mongol general moved like lightning, Qutuz advanced like the tide, slow, deliberate, inevitable. Between these two centers of power stretched a land caught in breathless expectation. Refugees from the north brought stories of the conqueror's cruelty. Merchants returning from Egypt spoke of discipline and faith. In the marketplaces of Gaza, rumor became debate. Some claimed that no army could withstand the horsemen of the steppe. Others insisted that the world itself would rebel against such destruction. The air of the Levant grew thick with prophecy. When Kitbuka learned that Egyptian forces had crossed the Sinai, he refused to believe they would dare approach directly. He dispatched scouts toward the coast and ordered detachments to watch the road to Jerusalem. Still, he delayed, unwilling to divide his army until he could strike decisively. That hesitation, born of pride, would shape the fate of empires. The delay gave Qutuz time to perfect his plan and to let Baybars weave a net of deception across the frontier. South of Gaza, Mamluk patrols appeared and vanished like mirages. They struck small Mongol outposts, seized couriers, and melted into the dunes before pursuit could organize. Each skirmish left Kitbuka more enraged and more uncertain of his enemy's strength. He doubled his scouts, yet information contradicted itself. One report claiming the Egyptians numbered 20,000, another 40. Some said the army was starving, others that divine favor fed it. Confusion, Baybars knew, was the first victory. The two leaders studied each other across distances, measured in leagues but closed by imagination. Both had been shaped by the same world, the cold north of the steppes, the code of obedience, the certainty that, courage alone justified life. Yet where Kitbuka's faith hardened into zeal, Qutuz's became clarity. He fought not for heaven's reward, but for the earth that sustained his people. The difference, invisible at first glance, would decide the battle. As the Mamluk columns moved through Palestine, their progress felt less like invasion than pilgrimage. Villagers emerged from hiding to watch them pass, murmuring blessings as they offered water and bread. The soldiers accepted these gifts in silence, their discipline unbroken. Every step northward carried the weight of vengeance for Baghdad, for Aleppo, for Damascus itself. The closer they came to the valley of Ain Jalut, the stronger that purpose grew, binding thousands of hearts to a single heartbeat. Kitbuka, hearing of their approach, broke camp at Baalbek and marched south. His army, lean from constant campaigning, moved swiftly along the old Roman roads. Behind them, dust hung in the air, like a second horizon. The general's confidence returned with motion. His priests rode beside him carrying icons. His drummers beat the rhythm of conquest. He told his men that the God of heaven had given him one more victory before his return to the east. At the same time, Qutuz and Baybars camped near the springs that gave the valley its name. The land there was green, even in late summer, its water clear and sweet, its slopes gentle. Baybars rode along the ridges, noting where the grass thickened and where the gullies might conceal hidden troops. When he returned to the Sultan's tent, he spread a rough map upon the sand. "Here they will descend," he said, tracing a line with his dagger. "Here they will believe we flee. And here," he tapped the narrow pass, "we shall close the door." Qutuz studied the drawing in silence, then nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said. The night before battle was unusually still. Across both camps, men prayed to different gods under the same stars. In the Mongol lines, priests burned incense and chanted hymns in forgotten tongues. In the Egyptian tents, imams recited verses of endurance and victory. The two worlds shared the same silence, the same anticipation, and perhaps the same fear. Somewhere between them, the fate of centuries waited for dawn. When morning came, mist lay low over the valley. From the hills, the Mamluks could hear the distant roll of Mongol drums, steady as thunder beyond sight. Horses shifted beneath their riders. Arrows gleamed in the pale light. Qutuz lifted his gaze to the eastern sky, where the first rim of the sun appeared. "Now," he said quietly, and turned to mount. The orders passed down the line in whispers. "Hold the ridge. Wait for Baybar's signal." Far below, the vanguard of Kitbuka's army began to advance, their banners streaming behind them like tongues of flame. The trap was set, the valley chosen, the hour ordained. Everything that had begun in the ashes of Baghdad now converged upon this narrow strip of earth where water, blood, and destiny would soon run together. The desert began where certainty ended. Beyond the last outposts of Sinai, the landscape dissolved into light, a white sea of shifting horizons. Here even the compass seemed uncertain, its needle trembling between heat and magnetism. Yet into this expanse rode the army of Egypt, its banners rising like islands in a mirage. Baybars al-Bundukdari rode ahead of the column, his falcon crest dark against the sky. He trusted movement more than maps. Instinct told him what no guide could. The desert, he knew, was a strategist's ally only to those who mastered its cruelty. At dawn, he ordered the vanguard to ride in silence, hooves muffled by sand. When the sun reached its height, the army halted beneath linen canopies, conserving strength until the heat relented. The rhythm of advance became ritual, ride, rest, pray, ride again. Each repetition burned discipline deeper into the flesh of men and horses alike. Behind Baybars rode Sultan Qutuz, calm and contained. He spoke little, preferring to watch the horizon where heat shimmered like water. In his silence, the soldiers found steadiness. In his restraint, purpose. When he dismounted, men hurried to kiss his stirrup, but he waved them away. "Save your reverence for God," he said. "Save your strength for the enemy." His voice, low and measured, carried farther than any shout. At night, when the desert cooled, the army came alive again. Fires flickered between dunes. Water skins passed hand to hand. The smell of boiled grain mingled with the resin of burning wood brought from Gaza. Storytellers whispered old victories, the crossing of the Red Sea, the triumphs of Saladin, to remind their comrades that deliverance had always come through struggle. Qutuz listened unseen, smiling faintly when he heard his own name woven into prophecy. Baybars, ever restless, moved from camp to camp, inspecting sentries and tracing patterns in the sand with the tip of his sword, calculating distances that could mean life or death by morning. The crossing tested not only bodies, but loyalties. Among the emirs, there were men who had once served Ayyubid princes and still mourned their lost privileges. They obeyed the sultan, but unease lingered. Baybars felt it like grit beneath his armor. One evening, he entered Qutuz's tent unannounced, the heat of frustration burning in his voice. "There are tongues speaking of retreat," he said. "If we turn back now, we will be hunted to the Nile." Qutuz looked up from his map. "Then let the doubters remain behind," he answered. "Those who march will become the shield of this faith." The simplicity of the reply left no space for argument. The days lengthened. Sandstorms rose without warning, blotting out the sun and turning day to bronze dusk. The soldiers wrapped their faces in cloth and pressed forward, guided by the sound of drums. When the storms passed, they found the dunes changed, as if the desert itself conspired to mislead them. Yet through every hardship, the army moved as one body, bound by habit and will. The veterans began to call themselves the chosen host, half in jest, half in conviction. Each evening, Baybars gathered his captains to review the route ahead. His planning was a study in precision. Scouts fanned out to mark every well, every wadi where grazing might be found. He divided the force into wings, assigning clear signals for attack and withdrawal. "The Mongols rely on momentum," he told them. "We will give them what they desire, a pursuit. They will chase shadows until their pride drives them into our hands." The captains nodded, understanding that their survival depended upon deception as much as courage. Beyond strategy lay faith. Before each march, imams rode along the ranks reciting verses of steadfastness, their voices rising above the creak of leather and the clatter of gear. Even men who had forgotten the words mouthed them now. Religion became less doctrine than endurance, a rhythm to march by, a pulse beneath exhaustion. At sunset, when the call to prayer echoed across the dunes, the entire army would kneel upon the sand, tens of thousands moving in perfect unison. The desert floor transformed into a single vast prostration. Watching from the ridge, Qutuz thought it resembled the beating of one immense heart. As the army approached the frontier, signs of the enemy began to appear. Burnt watchtowers, trampled fields, the carcasses of horses left where they had fallen. Baybars ordered scouts to gather intelligence from Bedouin tribes still roaming the borderlands. These wanderers, accustomed to survival between powers, offered information in exchange for gold, grain, or mercy. From them came reports that Kitbuka's forces were encamped near the plain of Ain Jalut, awaiting the invaders with confident patience. The Mongol general, they said, believed the Egyptians would crumble in the open field as others had done. Qutuz listened to the account and smiled without humor. Then let him find faith where he expects fear. The final march toward the valley began beneath a moon thin as a blade. The air smelled of approaching rain, a rare gift in that season. Baybars rode ahead with the light cavalry, guiding the main host through narrow passes, where rocks glowed white under starlight. The horses moved soundlessly, their hooves wrapped in cloth. Not a torch was lit. Every sound, the jingle of bridles, the murmur of orders, was swallowed by the wind. When dawn touched the peaks of Galilee, the army emerged from the last gorge and looked down upon the plain where destiny waited. Below them stretched a patchwork of green meadows and clear water. Herds grazed unaware of the armies that would soon trample the grass to mud. Far across the valley shimmered the tents of Kitbuka's camp, their banners glinting like coins in sunlight. Between the two forces lay the spring that had given the place its name, Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. Baybars studied the terrain as if memorizing scripture. "This," he murmured, "is the ground that will decide the world." Qutuz dismounted and knelt, scooping a handful of water from the stream that ran nearby. It was cold, tasting faintly of iron. "Then we fight here," he said. Orders rippled through the ranks. "Unpack supplies. Conceal the reserves behind the ridges. Let the horses drink once and no more." The camp settled into tense silence. Men tightened armor straps, checked bowstrings, whispered farewells. Across the valley, the Mongols moved like ants disturbed from their hill, unaware that the trap awaited their first step forward. As night fell again, the Mamluk camp held its breath. Fires burned low. The stars above seemed unnaturally bright. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, answered by the neighing of horses. Baybars walked the perimeter alone, feeling the weight of command settle on his shoulders, like the desert cold. Tomorrow, the armies would meet, and if fortune failed, the world would fall into shadow for 1,000 years. He paused beside Qutuz's tent, listening to the murmur of the Sultan's prayer within. Then he whispered to the night, half promise, half plea, "Let dawn favor the slaves." The wind rose, carrying the scent of rain across the valley. In that mingled darkness and anticipation, the earth itself seemed to wait, ancient, patient, remembering every empire that had claimed to be eternal. Before another sunrise, one more would learn how brief eternity could be. Rain came before dawn, thin and cold, drifting across the valley in silver threads. It settled the dust, darkened the grass, and wrapped both camps in a hush so deep that even the horses seemed to breathe more quietly. Beneath that veil of moisture, the world held its balance between stillness and fury. When the first light reached the ridges of Galilee, every man on both sides knew that waiting had ended. Across the plain, the Mongol encampment stirred. Drums thudded through the mist, a heartbeat of empire. Kitbuka rode before his lines, his armor black with rain, his face calm. He had fought in 100 battles and feared none. Before him stretched the valley of Ain Jalut, narrow and deceptive, hemmed by hills where morning shadows clung. He saw movement among them and mistook it for retreat. "The Egyptians flee," he said. "Follow and finish it." His captains spurred forward, banners snapping like fire in the wind. From the opposite slope, Baybars watched their advance. Water streamed from his helmet. His fingers rested lightly on the reins. Behind him, his vanguard waited in formation, archers with bows unstrung until the last moment, lancers poised for flight. He could hear the rumble of hooves growing louder, the sound swelling like an approaching storm. For an instant he closed his eyes, remembering the barracks of Cairo, the drills that had shaped these men, the faces of comrades who would never see this dawn. Then he lifted his arm. A single horn call broke the silence, long and low, the signal to begin. Arrows hissed through the mist. The first Mongol ranks faltered, surprised by resistance where they had expected collapse. Baybars' cavalry surged forward, loosing volleys at close range before wheeling away in sudden retreat. The feigned flight unfolded perfectly, practiced through weeks of rehearsal. Dust and rain mingled in the air, obscuring sightlines, confusing pursuit. Kitbuka's riders, sensing victory, pressed harder, their confidence rising with every Egyptian they thought routed. The valley drew them in, narrow as a funnel, its slopes closing like jaws. Behind the ridges, Qutuz waited with the main host. The mist blurred the world into shifting shapes, shields, spears, the pale glint of helmets. He sat motionless, listening. From beyond the hills came the roar of combat, the high cries of horses, the crash of steel. Then, suddenly, he heard what he had been waiting for, the horn of recall, short and sharp. The trap had sprung. He rose in the stirrups, raised his sword, and shouted for all to hear, "O Islam!" The cry rolled across the valley, like thunder released. From behind the hills, the Mamluks descended, wave upon wave of armored riders. Their charge struck the overextended Mongols from flank and rear, slicing through confusion before orders could form. The air filled with the whine of arrows and the clash of steel on steel. Rain turned the ground to mud. Horses slipped, men fell, and still the lines collided. For every rider who fell, another surged into his place. The valley that had been green at sunrise became a moving sea of bronze and red. Baybars, seeing the ambush succeed, wheeled his vanguard and struck again, this time head-on. His troops rejoined the fight with the precision of a door slamming shut. Between the hammer and anvil of Egyptian discipline, Kitbuka's force began to fracture. The Mongol general tried to rally his center, cutting down deserters with his own blade. His voice rose above the chaos, invoking heaven's wrath upon cowards. But the cries of his men were drowned by the thunder of hooves as the Mamluks closed in from every side. Qutuz fought at the front, his armor streaked with mud, his sword flashing with each swing. Chroniclers would later write that he tore off his helmet so his soldiers could see his face, shouting again and again, "O Islam," until his throat bled. The men who heard him said the words burned away fear. They fought as if the centuries of defeat behind them had gathered into a single hour of reckoning. The Mongols, for the first time in living memory, began to fall back. The rain ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Sunlight broke through the clouds, striking the valley like revelation. Steam rose from blood-soaked ground. Armor glimmered. The air tasted of iron and smoke. Kitbuka saw his line crumble and spurred toward the center, determined to die as his ancestors had lived, without surrender. He cut down 2 attackers before a spear pierced his horse and threw him to the ground. Captured and bound, he was brought before Qutuz, who regarded him with the same cold composure Hulagu had once shown the Caliph of Baghdad. "You have destroyed cities and slain innocents," said the Sultan. "What would you have of us now?" Kitbuka's answer was proud and brief: to die. His wish was granted before sunset. When the fighting ended, silence settled again upon Ain Jalut, a silence broken only by the wind moving through trampled grass. Corpses lay in heaps beside the stream. Broken standards fluttered in the shallow water. The smell of rain and blood mingled with the sweetness of crushed herbs. The Mongol army, thought invincible, had been shattered. Word of the victory began to spread even before the field was cleared. Messengers rode south through the night, carrying news that would echo from Cairo to Damascus. The tide had turned. As the Mamluks gathered their wounded, Qutuz dismounted and walked among them. He said nothing, only touched the hands of those still breathing, his face unreadable. Near the stream, he paused and looked toward the north, where the retreating enemy had vanished into the hills. For a long moment, he stood motionless, listening to the faint murmur of running water. "It began here," he murmured, recalling the ruin of Baghdad. "It ends here." Baybars approached, mud-streaked and smiling through exhaustion. "Not yet," he said. "There will be others." Qutuz nodded, though the words carried more weight than either man could measure. Around them, the valley glistened under the clean light of afternoon, the grass already beginning to rise again, green against the red earth. Life, as always, reclaimed its ground. By dusk, the army moved north to secure the route to Damascus. Behind them, they left a field that would be remembered not for its beauty or its blood, but for its meaning. Empires fall in silence, yet sometimes salvation begins with a single shout. At Ain Jalut, that cry had come from the lips of a man once sold as property, echoing across the centuries as proof that destiny could be defied. Evening found the valley shrouded in haze. Smoke from burned tents drifted low across the fields, mingling with the pale mist rising from the springs. The noise of battle had faded, replaced by a sound stranger still, the soft rustle of wind over the dead. Crows wheeled above the ridges, their cries sharp as splintered steel. The earth itself seemed stunned, as though unwilling to believe what had happened upon it. Among the wreckage moved the living. Mamluk soldiers stepped carefully between the fallen, searching for wounded comrades, cutting free the trapped horses that still struggled in the mud. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, rain, and iron. When the last arrows had been gathered, the army set to burying its own. They dug shallow graves near the stream, marking each with a spear and a scrap of cloth. No songs were sung. The silence of exhaustion was prayer enough. Sultan Qutuz walked the field alone, his armor streaked with grime, his sword nicked from use. Everywhere he looked, he saw fragments of history: a broken Mongol standard, a severed drum, a book soaked in blood. He knelt beside a fallen youth whose hand still clutched a bow, brushed the sand from his face, and whispered, "May the Almighty receive you as a warrior, and not as a slave." Around him, the survivors bowed their heads, recognizing in that gesture the end of one age and the beginning of another. At the center of the field lay the body of Kitbuka Noyan, covered with a cloak torn from his own banner. His expression was strangely serene, the defiance still carved upon his lips. Qutuz ordered that he be buried with honor. "He was brave," he said simply, "and bravery deserves its rest." The generals obeyed in silence. Even victory could not erase respect for a foe who had fought to the end. As night fell, the Mamluk camp came alive with subdued murmurs. Fires flickered between lines of horses. Armorers tended to battered gear. Surgeons worked by lamplight over the wounded. Baybars, his arm bandaged from a sword cut, moved among the tents like a man unable to rest. He stopped beside Qutuz, who stood gazing toward the north. "They will not return soon," Baybars said. "Their pride will take longer to heal than their losses." The Sultan nodded, though his face remained grave. "Pride returns," he replied. "So must vigilance." Through the night, messengers rode from the valley in every direction, south to Cairo, west to the coastal ports, east to the deserts where Bedouin scouts waited for word. Each carried the same message sealed with the Sultan's mark: the invincible have been defeated. Praise be to God, the world is spared. By dawn, the first of them had reached the frontier garrisons, and from there the news began its flight through rumor, sermon, and song. In Damascus, word of the battle arrived as the city prepared for another siege. People crowded the minarets, scanning the northern horizon for signs of dust. When the first, exhausted courier galloped through the gates crying, "Victory!" the city erupted. Bells of Christian churches joined the calls from mosques. Shopkeepers threw open their doors. Women wept openly in the streets. Chroniclers recorded that even the trees seemed greener that day. The conquerors who had come from the east were gone, and the city of the caliphs breathed again. To the north, fleeing remnants of Kitbuka's host staggered across the Euphrates, spreading confusion among the garrisons Hulagu had left behind. Officers argued, each blaming the other for disaster. Without their commander, their unity dissolved. The great empire that had devoured nations now trembled at the news of a single defeat. When word reached Hulagu himself in Tabriz, his rage was said to shake the earth. But distance and politics bound his hands. The succession crisis in the east demanded his presence, and vengeance would have to wait. For the first time since the days of his grandfather, a Mongol campaign had failed. In Egypt, the announcement reached Cairo at sunset. A messenger, his horse foaming with exhaustion, burst into the citadel court and fell to his knees before the emirs. When he spoke the words, "Ain Jalut," the hall erupted. The city outside answered with a roar that rolled across the Nile like thunder. Lanterns were lit on every minaret. Prayers filled the air from every quarter. For a people who had watched the world collapse, it was as if creation itself had been renewed. That night, the streets of Cairo became rivers of light. Men and women carried torches, singing verses that had not been heard since the victories of Saladin. The Sultan's name spread from mouth to mouth. Al-Malik, Al-Muzaffar, Qutuz, the triumphant king. Yet in the palace where the celebrations swelled, the man himself remained apart. He accepted no crown of flowers, no feast, no triumphal parade. "This day is not mine," he said to Baybars. "It belongs to those who fell to give it." His restraint only deepened the reverence of his people. Days later, the army began its march northward through Palestine to secure what had been won. They entered Damascus without a fight. The people lined the streets with carpets and branches of palm, showering the soldiers with petals and tears. Baybars rode at the head, his armor newly polished, his hawk-emblazoned banner held high. Behind him came Qutuz, helmetless, his gaze steady but inward, as though measuring the distance between triumph and fate. In the great mosque, he offered prayer for the dead of both armies, and for a world that might, for a time, know peace. Yet peace carried its own burdens. The victory had saved Islam from annihilation, but it had also unbound ambitions long held in check. The soldiers whispered of reward, the emirs of rank. In Baybars' eyes burned a restless fire, the same drive that had guided him through the battle now seeking purpose in its aftermath. Qutuz, perceptive as always, sensed it but chose silence. "Let the glory settle," he told his advisors. "Tomorrow will bring its own storms." As the army turned south again toward Egypt, the roads were lined with pilgrims, farmers, and clerics who had fled during the years of terror. They returned to their homes under the protection of the same men who had once been slaves, blessing them as saviors. The landscape that had known only fear began to breathe again. Wells reopened, markets revived, and prayers rose where ashes had been. When they reached the edge of the Sinai, the horizon once more dissolved into desert light. The soldiers who had survived carried with them not the arrogance of victors, but the weariness of men who had seen too much. The sands ahead shimmered with heat, the sky stretched without end, and in its vast emptiness, they could almost hear the echo of their own triumph fading. Behind them lay a valley turned to legend. Before them, the uncertain promise of power. For Qutuz, the journey home marked the closing of one destiny and the beginning of another. In his mind, the battle replayed endlessly. The cry, the charge, the turning of the tide. Yet even as he rode, he felt the old truth returning. Victory never comes without envy. Somewhere behind his own ranks, ambition walked beside loyalty, and the next chapter of Egypt's story was already taking shape in silence. The road south wound through silence. What had begun as a march of triumph soon felt like a pilgrimage through ghosts. Each valley the army crossed still carried the scent of smoke. Each town the echo of screams now replaced by wary cheers. The people who emerged from ruins to greet their liberators knelt in gratitude, but their joy only deepened the soldiers' fatigue. Glory, like the desert wind, could not be held in the hand for long. Qutuz rode at the center of the column, surrounded by banners that had once seemed radiant but now hung heavy with dust. He looked neither left nor right. His thoughts were fixed on the tasks ahead, rebuilding the garrisons, securing alliances, restoring the flow of trade that war had severed. To him, victory was not an ending, but a beginning that demanded vigilance. Yet among his companions, other dreams had begun to form. Behind him rode Baybars al-Bundukdari, his eyes on the horizon, his mind on Cairo. The battle had proved his genius. The people hailed him as the sword of deliverance. Yet power, once tasted, leaves a hunger sharper than any wound. He remembered promises, land, command, recognition, spoken by the Sultan before the campaign began. None had yet been fulfilled. Between them now stretched an unspoken distance, measured not in miles, but in ambition. The march through Palestine was slow. The wounded were carried on litters, the horses limped from exhaustion, and the baggage wagons groaned across broken ground. Rain fell one night near Hebron, turning the camp to mud. By torchlight the soldiers huddled together, murmuring tales of home, of wives and sons who would never know the scale of what had been won. Baybars moved among them, speaking softly, his words half comfort, half reminder of how much they had sacrificed for a ruler who now walked apart. He never spoke against Qutuz openly. He did not need to. Discontent travels on whispers faster than command can silence them. In Gaza, emissaries met the column with letters from Cairo. They brought news of celebration, festivals lasting days, mosques filled with prayers for the Sultan's long reign. The city's scholars wrote that Egypt had become the heart of the world again. Qutuz listened politely, thanked the messengers, and ordered the army onward. He knew that time would erode gratitude. Stability required presence, not memory. "We return to govern," he told Baybars, "not to revel." The words, meant as duty, sounded to the younger man like dismissal. Beyond the southern hills lay the endless plateau of Sinai. The journey across it was harsh, but familiar. These soldiers had crossed it once in hope, and now crossed it again in victory. Yet triumph felt lighter than expectation. The horizon offered nothing but mirage, and within that emptiness, envy took root. Baybars' companions urged him to demand his promised reward, the governorship of Aleppo, a prize Qutuz had hinted at but postponed. "The realm owes you more than words," they told him. He answered with silence, but his silence was consent. As the army neared the frontier oases, tempers frayed. Supplies ran low, and the desert, indifferent as ever, showed its teeth. One evening, near Al-Salihiyya, Qutuz halted to hunt gazelle with a small retinue. It was a gesture of ease, meant to calm the weary troops. The hunt began in good spirits. Laughter, the flash of spears, the thunder of hooves across the sand. Then, in the confusion of pursuit, the laughter ceased. Accounts differ on what followed. Some say an arrow struck from behind. Others that swords flashed in the dusk as the Sultan turned to dismount. Chroniclers agree only that Baybars was near, and that when the dust cleared, Qutuz lay mortally wounded, his face calm, his eyes open to the fading light. He had time to whisper a single phrase, "O Islam," the same words he had shouted on the field of Ain Jalut. Then the man who had saved a civilization fell beneath the silence he had earned. For a long moment, no one moved. The hunters stood frozen, the desert wind tugging at their cloaks. Baybars knelt beside the body, his expression unreadable. When at last he rose, he turned to the stunned officers and spoke with the authority of inevitability. "The Sultan is gone," he said. "The army must not break. Egypt still needs command." In that instant, command became his. The army learned of the death at dawn. Qutuz was buried where he had fallen, a simple grave marked by stones. The soldiers prayed, wept, and rode on in silence. None dared speak of what they suspected. In their eyes, Baybars already bore the aura of destiny. By the time the columns reached the Nile, he had been proclaimed al-Malik al-Zahir, the manifest king. Cairo greeted its returning army with triumphal arches and songs that mingled sorrow with relief. The people mourned Qutuz as a martyr and hailed Baybars as his chosen successor. Few questioned the story. Victory demanded continuity, and continuity had found its voice. In the great mosque, Baybars knelt before the pulpit and swore to defend the land that Qutuz had saved. His oath rang clear beneath the domes. "By the Lord of Heaven, the sword will not sleep." Those who heard it believed him. Under his command, the Mamluk Sultanate would rise from defense to dominion. The Nile's kingdom, born from chains, had mastered its fate. Yet the price of that mastery lay buried beneath the sands of Sinai, a grave without inscription, a silence that none would break. The man who had turned back the empire of the steppes would remain in history's shadow, remembered in victory but not in peace. As evening settled over Cairo, the muezzin's call drifted across the river, long and mournful. The light upon the water trembled like memory. Somewhere beyond the city, the wind that had carried the dust of Ain Jalut stirred once more, whispering through the reeds of the Nile. Empires would rise again, and others would fall. But for that brief moment, the world belonged to those who had learned that even the smallest cry, "O Islam," could silence the thunder of an empire. The wind from the desert followed the army into Cairo. It carried with it the dust of Ain Jalut, the scent of iron, and the silence of a man buried far from home. Behind the walls of the citadel, the city waited, streets hung with banners, markets overflowing with spectators, mosques echoing with prayers of thanksgiving. The people had prepared to welcome Sultan Qutuz, savior of Islam. What returned to them instead was his coffin and the man who had slain him. Yet grief and politics seldom move at the same pace. Even before the funeral rites ended, the machinery of succession began to turn. The army, weary of uncertainty, looked to Baybars al-Bundukdari, the general whose strategy had won their greatest victory and whose ambition now required a crown. In the barracks and courtyards, his name was spoken, with equal parts reverence and fear. None wished to question the manner of Qutuz's death. The empire could not afford hesitation. Egypt demanded a ruler, and Baybars was already behaving as one. 3 days after the army's return, the emirs gathered in the Hall of Justice beneath the domes of the citadel. There, amid the scent of incense and horse sweat, Baybars rose from among them. His armor was plain, his face drawn by fatigue, yet his voice carried the certainty of command. "The sword of Islam cannot lie idle," he said. "If we rest, the enemy will rise again. The Sultan is dead. The cause remains." The words were both eulogy and claim. By the time he knelt for the oath of allegiance, resistance had dissolved. The court hailed him as Al-Malik al-Zahir Baybars, the manifest king. The coronation took place on a Friday, the day of prayer. The great mosque of Cairo overflowed. Even the streets beyond were filled with crowds listening through open windows. When the khutbah was read in his name, the people responded with cries that shook the minarets. In that moment, Egypt felt its heart beat again. For the first time since the fall of Baghdad, the Islamic world possessed not only survival, but direction. A new dynasty had been born, not of royal blood, but of will. Baybars' first acts as ruler were neither extravagant nor symbolic. He dismissed corrupt officials, reopened the trade routes to Syria, and ordered the rebuilding of the fortresses along the coast that had fallen into neglect. In his council chambers, maps covered the walls, each marked with notes in his own hand. The empire he envisioned would not merely endure, it would dominate. "We are the guardians now," he told his advisors. "The heart of the world beats here, not in the ruins of the Tigris." Across Egypt, the effect was immediate. The army, once a mercenary institution, became the backbone of government. The Mamluk code, discipline, loyalty, hierarchy, was applied to the state itself. Posts were assigned by merit rather than birth. Promotion came through obedience and skill. Soldiers who had once been slaves now commanded provinces, and their success bound them to the throne they had helped create. In this strange inversion, the chains of servitude had become the girders of empire. Meanwhile, messengers rode to Damascus and Aleppo, carrying the new sultan's decrees. Local governors who had fled during the Mongol invasion were restored under Egyptian authority. The cities, starved of stability, welcomed the return of order. Tax collectors reappeared, judges reopened their courts, and markets filled with traders once more. The caravans that had avoided the war-torn routes from Anatolia to the Red Sea now found safe passage under Mamluk banners. Egypt's wealth began to flow northward, buying loyalty with the coin of prosperity. In the palace overlooking the Nile, Baybars kept the memory of his predecessor alive in ceremony, if not in sentiment. Qutuz's tomb was enclosed in marble, his name recited in official prayers. The gesture satisfied piety and silenced suspicion, though few doubted the truth of how he had died. To the new sultan, honoring the fallen ruler served a purpose. It cast continuity over the fracture of betrayal. Egypt could not afford to appear divided. The illusion of unity was as vital as unity itself. Beyond the frontiers, word of Egypt's transformation spread with awe and alarm. In the Christian ports of the Levant, princes debated whether to offer tribute or truce. The Mongol governors in the east watched warily, their supply lines shrinking as the Mamluks fortified every crossing of the Euphrates. Even the distant courts of Europe took notice. Pilgrims returning from the Holy Land spoke of a black-bannered power rising on the Nile, one that commanded both sword and faith with equal authority. For Baybars, consolidation was only the beginning. He understood that survival required legitimacy, and legitimacy demanded symbols. The Abbasid Caliphate had perished in the ashes of Baghdad, but its memory still sanctified rule. In secret councils, he began to plan what seemed impossible, to bring the caliphate back to life. His agents scoured the refugee communities of Syria and Iraq, seeking any surviving descendant of the Prophet's house. Months later, they returned with a frail scholar, claiming lineage to the fallen dynasty. Baybars received him in state, clothed him in black, and proclaimed him Caliph al-Mustansir Billah, servant of God and heir to the house of Abbas. The ceremony transformed Egypt from mere kingdom to protector of Islam's sacred legacy. The coronation of the new caliph took place in 1261. Beneath the great dome of the mosque, Baybars stood beside him as the assembly swore allegiance. When the caliph placed his hand upon the sultan's shoulder and declared him Sword of the Faith, the symbolism was complete. Spiritual and temporal authority, joined once more, had found refuge on the Nile. The applause that followed rolled like thunder through Cairo's streets. For the first time in generations, the Muslim world looked not east but west for guidance. The months that followed were filled with renewal. Scholars who had fled the Mongol devastation found patronage at the Sultan's court. The libraries of Baghdad could not be replaced, but Cairo's scribes began copying what had survived. Mosques rose beside madrasas. Artisans carved calligraphy into stone until the city itself seemed to speak in scripture. The arts of war were not neglected. Foundries expanded. New fortresses ringed the delta, and shipyards at Alexandria echoed with hammers. Egypt became fortress, market, and sanctuary in one. Still, beneath the triumph, lay a shadow. The men who had fought beside Qutuz remembered the desert and the silence of his death. They spoke of it quietly in corners, but their loyalty to Baybars was born more of fear than love. The new sultan sensed this and ruled with vigilance. Spies moved unseen through the ranks of the emirs. Plots ended before they began. He had learned that mercy, in times such as these, was a form of weakness. Power, once seized, must be guarded as jealously as faith itself. Even so, for all his caution, Baybars was not ungrateful. When spring came, he rode to the outskirts of Cairo, where the army had once mustered for Ain Jalut. There, on open ground, he ordered a mosque built in honor of the fallen. Its foundation stone bore a simple inscription: "From bondage we rose, and by faith we endured." He stood watching as the first blocks were laid, and for a moment his face softened. In that silence, even he seemed to remember that before ambition and empire, there had been belief. By the year's end, Egypt stood transformed. The Caliphate had found new shelter. The Mongols had withdrawn beyond the Euphrates, and the Nile kingdom had become the axis of the world it had saved. Yet history, ever impatient, was already gathering new storms beyond its borders. The Crusader ports remained, restless and watchful. The Ilkhans to the east plotted revenge, and the man who had risen by betrayal now ruled an empire whose gratitude was as dangerous as its memory. For the moment, however, the world was still. The sun set over Cairo in gold and crimson, glinting off the domes newly gilded under Baybars' reign. From the minarets rose the call to prayer, deep and resonant, flowing down the river like music over water. The empire that had been lost in the smoke of Baghdad was reborn in the light of the Nile. Night settled over Cairo with the quiet confidence of a city newly certain of itself. The domes glowed faintly beneath moonlight. The minarets stood like sentinels along the river, and for the first time in living memory, the people slept without fear of invasion. The kingdom born from servitude had become the refuge of Islam. Yet within the citadel, Sultan Baybars remained wakeful. Peace, he knew, was a battle of its own. From the balconies of his palace, he could see the flicker of lamps reflected upon the Nile. Barges drifted past, laden with goods from Upper Egypt, grain, papyrus, spices, the veins through which the realm's prosperity flowed. The capital hummed with industry, smiths working late in the forges, scribes copying texts rescued from the ruins of Baghdad, merchants counting silver minted with the new sultan's name. To the people, Baybars appeared the perfect ruler, devout, tireless, incorruptible. To his ministers, he was a man who never forgot that power, once taken, must never be shared. His reforms began with the army. The victory at Ain Jalut had proven the strength of the Mamluk system, and Baybars intended to make it the spine of his rule. Every year, new recruits were purchased from the northern steppes and trained in the same discipline that had shaped him. They were raised within barracks that functioned as monasteries of war, schools where obedience replaced heritage and loyalty replaced blood. These men knew no father but the Sultan, no home but the sword. Through them, Baybars ensured that Egypt's throne would never again depend upon birthright or foreign dynasty. From the army, he turned to the state. He reorganized the provinces, appointing governors drawn from his most capable officers. Taxes were standardized, corruption punished with unflinching severity. Inspectors traveled without warning from town to town, their arrival feared more than invasion. Justice, the Sultan declared, is a sharper weapon than the blade. For many, his justice was indeed cutting, swift, impersonal, and final. Yet under that rigor, prosperity returned. Farmers tilled fields abandoned during the wars, trade routes reopened, and ships once again sailed from Alexandria to the ports of Cyprus and Genoa. The wealth of 3 continents now flowed through the markets of Cairo. Such order demanded spectacle to sustain it. Baybars understood the language of symbols as well as of laws. He rebuilt the citadel that dominated the city, raising towers that shone like mirrors in the sun. New mosques rose beside it, their domes carved with inscriptions praising both God and the Sultan who served him. On festival days, he rode through the streets in armor of polished steel, surrounded by his regiments, an image of power sanctified by faith. The people cheered, the scholars bowed. Cairo, they said, had become the second Mecca, a city where prayer and rule shared one breath. But even as he ruled through grandeur, Baybars never forgot the shadows that had lifted him to the throne. He ruled among men who had seen him strike down his sovereign, and trust, once broken, left permanent cracks. At council, he listened more than he spoke, his gaze measuring every gesture. Rewards were lavish, suspicion more so. Emirs who showed too much independence found themselves reassigned to distant fortresses or dispatched on campaigns from which few returned. His rule was efficient because it was absolute. Beyond Egypt, new challenges stirred. The Ilkhanate in Persia, though wounded, had not forgotten its defeat. From Tabriz, Hulagu's successors plotted revenge, sending raiding parties across the Euphrates to test the defenses of Syria. Baybars answered with precision. In 1262, his generals struck deep into Mongol-held territory, driving the invaders back across the river. Each year thereafter, he reinforced the northern frontier, fortifying bridges and garrisons until the Euphrates itself became a wall of steel. For the first time in a century, the eastward wind of conquest met resistance it could not bend. At the same time, the Crusader states that dotted the Levant remained thorns in his path. Their fortresses, Acre, Tripoli, and Antioch, stood as reminders of past humiliation. Yet Baybars, ever pragmatic, treated them first as instruments rather than targets. He negotiated truces when convenient, traded grain for iron, allowed merchants to pass through their ports, and learned from their defenses. Only when his own power was secure did he turn upon them. Between 1265 and 1271, his armies swept the coast, capturing fortress after fortress, with a relentlessness that stunned both friend and foe. Each victory was marked by restoration, not destruction. Wells repaired, mosques erected, markets reopened. Where crusaders had once prayed, muezzins now called to prayer. As Egypt's influence spread, Damascus became its northern capital. Baybars appointed trusted officers to govern there, men whose loyalty was measured by distance from home. The city, long accustomed to conquest and occupation, thrived under this new arrangement. Its scholars resumed teaching. Its artisans revived their crafts. The Sultan himself visited often, holding court beneath the vaulted ceilings, once built by Umayyads and Abbasids alike. To the citizens, his presence felt like the return of empire. To Baybars, it was proof that empire could exist without lineage. Yet even in victory, unease followed him. The ghosts of Qutuz and Shajar al-Dur haunted whispers in the palace corridors, reminders that every Mamluk who rose by the sword might fall by it. Baybars countered memory with motion. He kept his court in constant activity. Construction projects, military parades, religious ceremonies. Stillness, he feared, bred conspiracy. When fatigue overtook him, he withdrew to his private gardens overlooking the river, where fountains murmured beneath date palms. There, surrounded by silence, he allowed himself a single luxury: thought. Chroniclers who glimpsed him in these moments wrote that his face, hardened in command, softened in solitude. Perhaps he saw in the river's flow the reflection of his own reign, restless, ceaseless, and unable to stop. Cairo flourished beneath his rule. Pilgrims from Africa and Asia converged upon the city, calling it the Mother of Kingdoms. The re-established Abbasid Caliphate lent divine legitimacy to Baybars' every decree, though few doubted where real power resided. Scholars debated theology under his patronage. Poets compared him to the heroes of old. Merchants praised him for keeping the roads safe from bandits. Even foreign rulers sought his friendship. The Byzantine emperor sent gifts. The king of Nubia pledged tribute. From Spain to India, the echo of his name traveled with caravans and sailors alike. But power exacts its toll in isolation. The Sultan, who had united the Muslim world under the banner of survival, began to find no equals left to speak with. His court grew silent around him, afraid to break his concentration or interrupt his meditations. On certain nights, he summoned storytellers to recite tales of Genghis Khan and of Saladin, listening not for entertainment but for understanding. He had defeated one and succeeded the other. Yet he sensed that both now measured him from the pages of history. In the 12th year of his reign, as new fortresses rose along the frontier and scholars praised him in every mosque, Baybars looked out from the citadel over the city he had transformed. Lanterns reflected in the Nile like a chain of stars. The hum of distant markets drifted upward through the warm air. Egypt had become what he had dreamed, the heart of a world restored. Yet in that perfection, he felt again the restlessness that had driven him since youth. "We have given the faith its sword," he said to an aide beside him. "Who will give it its peace?" No one answered. The question lingered in the air as the call to prayer rose once more over Cairo. The same call that had guided slaves through darkness and led them to victory at Ain Jalut. Its echo carried down the river toward lands still scarred by empire. A reminder that triumph is never an ending, but a beginning, disguised by glory. By the time the Nile rose for the 13th season of his reign, Sultan Baybars al-Zahir had become a figure larger than his own lifetime. His name carried weight across 3 continents, spoken with equal measures of fear and reverence. Envoys addressed him as Lord of the 2 Seas and Guardian of the Faith. Traders from Spain and India alike sought his protection. Scholars in Damascus and Cairo copied his decrees as models of justice. He ruled an empire that stretched from the deserts of Libya to the mountains of Armenia. Yet his ambitions reached farther still, to give shape to a world reborn from ruin. The age that followed the victory of Ain Jalut was one of rebuilding. Where the Mongol advance had left emptiness, the Mamluks planted permanence. Across Syria, caravans returned to roads long silent, guided by the security of Egyptian garrisons. Markets revived in cities once charred by conquest. The sound of hammers and prayers replaced the drumbeat of fear. In Damascus, artisans carved new fountains in the courtyards of old palaces. In Aleppo, scholars reopened madrasas that had lain abandoned for years. The wounds of invasion began to scar over, leaving the hard tissue of endurance. From his court in Cairo, Baybars watched these changes with satisfaction tempered by vigilance. He knew that stability was not peace. It was labor. Each victory required reinforcement. Every frontier demanded attention. His messengers rode constantly between capitals, bearing instructions written in his own hand, a ruler's script as precise as the man himself. Even his leisure was orderly. Falconry in the desert at dawn, council meetings at midday, prayers in the evening, followed by reports read aloud until midnight. "Sleep," he once said, "is the tax that kings must pay to weakness." Beyond Egypt's borders, the balance of power began to shift. The Ilkhanate in Persia remained formidable, but its aura of invincibility had faded. The princes who ruled its provinces hesitated to provoke the Mamluks again. They built fortresses rather than armies, and sent envoys rather than threats. To the north, Anatolia fractured under competing dynasties, many of whom sought alliance with Cairo. In these alliances, Baybars saw both opportunity and peril. Diplomacy, to him, was another form of conquest, one measured in patience instead of blood. Still, he did not abandon the sword. The Crusader strongholds that had survived his earlier campaigns became targets once more. In 1268, he seized Antioch, the oldest of the Christian principalities in the east. Chroniclers describe the assault as both ruthless and inevitable. The city's walls crumbled beneath the weight of siege towers. Its churches were converted to mosques before the dust settled. For Christendom, the loss was an echo of Ain Jalut, proof that divine favor had shifted. For Islam, it was vindication. The frontiers of the faith, once collapsing, now advancing. The triumphs continued along the coast. Fortresses that had once flown the banners of Europe were repurposed to guard the trade of the Red Sea. Sailors carried Egyptian grain to the hungry markets of the Mediterranean, and spices from India filled the warehouses of Alexandria. The Nile's wealth, multiplied by commerce, transformed Cairo into a city of light. Its mosques gleamed with marble brought from quarries as distant as Anatolia. Its streets overflowed with scholars, poets, and jurists, seeking the patronage of the most powerful court in the Islamic world. Under Baybars' administration, knowledge itself became a form of devotion. He endowed libraries in both Cairo and Damascus, stocked with manuscripts rescued from the ashes of Baghdad. He invited mathematicians from Persia, physicians from Yemen, astronomers from the Maghreb. The sciences, stifled by years of war, found renewal under his watch. Chroniclers record that he would sometimes visit these institutions unannounced, questioning the scholars with the same rigor he demanded of his soldiers. A nation, he declared, must be defended by the mind as by the sword. Even the Caliph he had installed in Cairo benefited from this revival. Though largely ceremonial, the institution lent spiritual unity to the diverse lands now governed from the Nile. Each Friday, the Caliph's name was proclaimed from pulpits across the empire, linking Cairo to Damascus, Mecca, and Medina in a single rhythm of prayer. The fiction of continuity became a fact of stability. The faithful needed a caliph as they needed the sun, even if it shone from behind clouds. But the greatest monument of Baybars' reign was not made of stone. It was the system he left behind, a state run by merit, sustained by discipline, and united by purpose. His administrative network extended into every province, a lattice of governors, judges, and tax collectors who owed their positions to service rather than birth. They ruled in his name, yet their loyalty was to the structure he had built, not merely to the man. In this, Baybars achieved what centuries of dynasties had failed to grasp, that power rooted in obedience outlives the ruler who wields it. As the years passed, the Sultan aged but did not soften. The same will that had carried him through battle drove him now through the routines of governance. He inspected arsenals, audited treasuries, received pilgrims returning from Mecca, and listened to petitions from peasants as patiently as to those of princes. Chroniclers marveled that he seemed never to tire. When asked his secret, he replied, "I do not rule, I endure." Yet endurance bears its price. The closer he came to perfection, the lonelier it became. Those who had known him as a comrade in war now approached as subjects, and those who flattered him most were those he trusted least. At times, when the palace corridors fell silent, he would stand by the window and look toward the desert, remembering the dawn at Ain Jalut when victory had been pure, unsullied by intrigue. In the distance, lightning flickered over the horizon. Even storms, he murmured once, must one day seek rest. Despite the solitude of rule, his vision never faltered. He strengthened the pilgrimage routes to the holy cities, building hostels, wells, and fortresses to protect travelers from bandits. He reopened the roads to North Africa and the Caucasus, weaving the far edges of the Islamic world into a single tapestry of movement. Cairo became its heart, pulsing with caravans that carried not only goods, but ideas, jurisprudence, poetry, philosophy. The same empire that had survived by the sword now thrived through exchange. In those final years, Baybars could walk through the markets of Cairo, disguised in plain robes, and hear his own legend growing around him. Some called him the second Saladin, others the hammer of the Mongols. Children played games reenacting his victories. Poets composed verses that turned his life into parable. Yet beneath the praise ran a quieter truth. The world he had built could never belong entirely to him. It belonged to the order that would follow, the Mamluk state, stern and enduring, born from discipline and bound to destiny. When he died in 1277, poisoned by a cup of sherbet prepared in celebration of another victory, the news spread through the empire like the passing of an age. Bells tolled in Christian quarters. Muezzins wept as they called the faithful to prayer. His body was carried to Damascus, the city he had rebuilt and laid to rest beneath a dome of carved cedar. Over his tomb, the people placed a simple inscription. He restored what was broken, and so he had. From the ruins of Baghdad's libraries and the ashes of Aleppo's mosques, from the chains that had bound slaves and the dust that had swallowed empires, Baybars had drawn something enduring. His rule ended where it began, in the echo of Ain Jalut, in the valley where history had turned. The armies of the steppe had been stopped, the faith had found new shelter, and Egypt, the land that had once purchased warriors, had become the world's defender. At dusk, the light over Damascus turned copper, glinting off the domes he had raised. Pilgrims passing the mosque that bore his name paused to pray, some for his soul, others for the strength to emulate his resolve. Beyond them, the wind stirred the trees, whispering through the streets like memory. Empires would rise again and fall as they always had, but the mark of that age, the discipline of slaves who became kings, the courage of men who refused to vanish, would outlast them all. For centuries to come, travelers in distant lands would speak of that miracle by the spring of Goliath, where the tide of conquest met its shore. They would remember the cry that had shattered silence, "O Islam," and the world reborn in its echo. When the funeral cortege left Damascus, the city fell silent behind it. Merchants closed their stalls, scholars laid down their pens. The man who had ruled a generation of war and revival was gone, and the air itself seemed to hesitate in his absence. Yet even as the mourners crossed the desert toward Cairo, life in his empire continued without falter. That was his truest monument, an order so complete that it could endure its master's death. In the months that followed, the machinery he had built kept turning. Governors maintained their posts, caravans continued their routes, judges dispensed law from the same pulpits that had once proclaimed his name. The Mamluk system, perfected under his reign, had become self-sustaining, a republic of soldiers disguised as a monarchy. Each new sultan would rise from the same barracks, swear the same oath, and rule within the framework that Baybars had forged. No dynasty of blood would follow him. The dynasty was discipline itself. Across the Levant, the fortresses he had strengthened guarded the frontiers with quiet efficiency. Mongol raids still tested them from time to time, but none broke through. The invincible empire of the steppes had met its boundary. Westward, the last crusader ports dwindled, isolated by treaties and attrition, their banners fading under the sun. In 1291, less than a generation after Baybar's death, the Mamluks seized Acre, ending 2 centuries of crusader rule in the east. Chroniclers wrote that the sea beyond the walls looked calm that day, as though the world itself had exhaled. Egypt entered an age of confidence. Under Baybar's successors, the Sultanate became the center of a network that stretched from the Atlas Mountains to the Persian frontier. Pilgrims traveled safely to Mecca under Mamluk escort. Scholars moved freely between Cairo, Damascus, and Jerusalem. Artisans carried their crafts from Andalusia to India. The Nile Kingdom, once an outpost, now defined the rhythm of the Islamic world. Its currency set standards of weight and purity. Its scholars defined the language of law and faith. Where once caravans had skirted the land in fear, they now converged upon it like tributaries to a single river. The capital itself reflected this transformation. Cairo became a living map of empire, its skyline crowded with minarets, its streets alive with the murmur of a dozen tongues. The markets overflowed with goods from every horizon: Persian carpets, African ivory, Italian glass. Beneath the dome of Baybar's own mosque, students debated theology beside merchants counting coin. The city had absorbed the world it had once defended, and in doing so had become the heir of every civilization it had outlasted. The revival reached beyond commerce and learning. Architects raised monuments whose proportions recalled the geometry of the heavens. Poets found in the Mamluk story a theme that never faded: the rise of the lowly, the triumph of faith over fate. Painters illuminated manuscripts with scenes of battle and rebirth, the flames of Baghdad giving way to the golden domes of Cairo. Even the common folk who measured history and proverbs remembered Baybars as the lion of the faith, a hero whose shadow stretched across generations. In the songs sung by boatmen on the Nile, his name became rhythm. In the tales told by desert fires, it became prophecy. Meanwhile, beyond the eastern horizon, the descendants of Hulagu fought among themselves for dominion. The Ilkhanate fractured, its princes turning to Islam one by one, as though conversion were the final tribute owed to the faith they had once sought to destroy. The Mongol storm had spent its fury. The riders of the steppe became governors and patrons, their thunder reduced to ceremony. What had begun as annihilation ended in assimilation. In this strange reversal, Baybar's victory proved more than military. It had absorbed the conqueror into the conquered. For centuries afterward, the Mamluks stood as guardians of that balance. When plague swept through the world in the 14th century, it was Cairo's scholars who preserved medicine and law. When the Ottoman tide rose from Anatolia, it was the Mamluks who held the bridges of Syria until the last. Empires continued to change their banners, yet the institutions Baybars had built endured, echoing his discipline long after his name had weathered to legend. And legend it became. In every age, storytellers found him anew. To the poets of Cairo, he was the lion who roared against the storm. To the chroniclers of Europe, the ruler who stopped the eastward march of apocalypse. To those who came later, the Ottomans, the Arabs, the Turks, he was the measure of command, the slave who forged an empire, the general who saved a civilization. Even when the world he built finally fell, its memory remained intact, carved in stone and story alike. Centuries after his death, pilgrims still visited the spring of Ain Jalut. The valley lay quiet now, green and serene, its waters clear as glass. Shepherds grazed their flocks where cavalry once charged. Children threw stones into the pool where armies had met. But the earth remembered. When wind swept down from the hills, it carried with it faint echoes, the clash of steel, the cry that had once torn the morning sky. Travelers who paused to drink swore they could feel history in the water, cool, weightless, and enduring. From that valley to the domes of Cairo stretched a line of memory that no conquest could erase. It marked the point where despair turned to defiance, where the tide of history reversed its course. The Mongol storm had reached its limit there. The Islamic world had found its second breath. And though centuries would pass, though new empires would rise and fall, the story of Ain Jalut would remain, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, faith and courage could redraw the map of the world. As evening settles over the Nile, the last light catches the minarets built by Baybars and his heirs. Their shadows lengthen across the river, stretching toward the deserts from which their first captives came. The call to prayer rises, ancient and unchanged, weaving through the air like the memory of victory. Somewhere beyond hearing, the wind still carries a whisper over distant plains, an echo of hooves, the cry of a sultan, and the moment when history itself drew breath and turned back.